Okay, I have 7 o'clock, so I'd like to get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Gross, educator in Central Michigan. On behalf of the Field Crops team, I'd like to welcome everyone to the start of the 2022 virtual breakfast series. Doesn't seem like it's been 5 years, Phil, but here we go. A lot of decisions are going to be important this year. A lot of challenges, a lot of excitement, but based on some of the supplies, I think every decision we make is going to be critical. So I think these breakfasts are going to really provide growers, agribusinesses with that timely information that they're going to need to make those good decisions. Again, I'd like to remind everybody to please mute yourself during the presentation. Please sign in with your first and last name. Click on participant list, find your name and hover. Click more, then rename yourself. I'd like us to remind people that we need to put questions in the chat box, and after the presentations, we will be able to answer those questions.
Paul, I have a question for you before we really hop into this. Okay. Where are all the donuts?
Where are all the donuts? Well,
that's your job today as the host to bring all the donuts for everybody.
Well, I have nothing. I'm retaining donuts. I ate them all. If you can see the powder around my mouth, that's all I got.
Okay.
But before we get started, we're going to do some data collection at the end. The collection of demographic data for this program participants is important and a mandated aspect of all the Michigan State University Extension programming. This is voluntary, and the information that you provide will not be used in any way to identify you personally, but rather as an anonymous member that participated in the program. Prior to the RUP and CCA codes, will be given a poll, will be provided for you. We ask that you take a moment and fill out that information. Thank you very much for that. And again, I'd like to welcome everyone, and I'd like to welcome our first presenter of the season is Dr. Christy Sprague. Good morning, Christy.
Hi, Paul. Good morning, everybody. So today, what I'd like to do is just kind of kick off this year's virtual breakfast with talking a little bit about early season weed control. And one of the things I really want to focus on is, as most of us know, there's been some issues with product shortages. So what are some potential options that we have? What are some of the things that we should be looking out for? Obviously, just kind of as a background, why early season weed control is important. There's a lot of reasons. There's certain things that can happen. Obviously, if we have a mat of some of those winter annuals, as you go out and look at some of our fields right now, we're kind of sitting here waiting for some of that weed growth. We've been cold, and with this recent wet weather, I'm sure Jeff will kind of fill us in on where we're going to be going. But by the time we're able to get out in the field, we know that we're going to have some winter annual weeds that are going to be out of control. And a lot of those winter annuals can interfere with both planting and tillage operations. Other things that we see is that a lot of times we see that those weeds can compete with those germinating crop seeds, whether it's corn, soybeans, sugar beets, anything for moisture, light, nutrients, and they can actually physically interfere with that crop emergence. Couple other things. Some of our winter annuals we know can harbor some destructive insects. And I'm sure if Chris DeFonso's on here this morning, she can probably talk about some of those insects. And then we know that some of the winter annual weeds can actually serve as hosts for soybean cyst nematode. And one of the other things is if we don't get good early season weed control, it definitely makes those weeds a lot harder to control. And we've seen that with certain things like mare's tail or common lamb's quarters. But most importantly, if we're not controlling weeds early in the season, we see a lot of early season weed competition. And what I thought I would do is just kind of share a slide of some work that we did several years ago, just showing what happens if you don't have good early season weed control, and just basically removing weeds before planting, about 7 days before planting, at planting, or if we wait until those weeds or those crops start to come up, like with soybeans at the unifoliate stage, we can see, up to about 6 bushels of loss at the end of the season. And as we keep delaying that weed control, we can see more yield loss. So especially when we start thinking about the economics of this year and where soybean prices are, If you're looking at something, I just looked yesterday, soybean prices around $16 a bushel. If we're losing, close to 7 bushel there, that's a pretty big jump in, profit that we could have. So it's really important to make sure that we have good early season weed control. So really what we want to do is make sure that we plant into a weed-free seed bed. And then, I've talked about this for a number of years, making sure that we start clean. And we'll talk about some of the ways we can do that. But we know that there are going to be some challenges for this year. And probably the biggest challenge that we're going to run into this year is really with the supply chain. And a lot of times we've seen that we know this year we're going to have some herbicide shortages. And in particular, 2 of the main ones that we use a lot, both in pretty much any of our field crops, are glyphosate and glyphosate or Liberty. But we also know that there's going to be some other products that are going to be in short supply. And this winter, I've tried to kind of get people primed to make sure that they're talking to the retailers to know what actual products that they are going to be able to get and what time period. So it's going to be important to make sure you kind of keep that open communication up to know what that you have, but also thinking about what are going to be some of those more effective options or some alternatives. And the other thing that we've seen definitely this year is increases in product prices. So again, what I'd like to do today is talk about some of the alternative options and really focusing on the early season part of weed control. So especially with some of the herbicide shortages, one thing that if you're kind of one of those growers that are able to do some tillage, this is one way that we could potentially think of, an alternative to a herbicide burn down. I'm not talking about trying to get people to switch out of their long-term no-till acres, but if you're a person that does tillage every once in a while, this might be a year that you might find that more beneficial from the standpoint, especially if you're not able to get some of the different products that you might need for a good burn down to really control some of those early season weeds. Just a couple quick reminders when we're doing spring tillage is making sure that we start out trying to till those weeds when they're small and that the soil isn't too wet, because we know when it's too wet, we end up with a lot of compaction that can cause some issues later in the season, particularly on that crop growth, and which can actually affect yield at the end of the season. If we wait until those weeds are too large, a lot of times it makes them a lot harder to control, especially when we start thinking about some of the post options that we might have available. And we're going to be looking at some alternatives for those because, again, we're going to be short on some of the different products. One other quick reminder as far as tillage, when we're doing tillage, we want to make sure that we're using the tillage tools that are going to actually uproot some of those winter annual weeds or maybe some of those perennials. And just think about some of the vertical tillage tools that we have may not be quite as effective for weed removal. They're really nice at smoothing out, some ruts from the fall, maybe even getting a good seed bed. But the thing we need to do is making sure that we uproot those weeds, in particular, some of those harder to control weeds like common lamb's quarters and mare's tail or horseweed. But, there's a lot of areas where we're going to want to be doing, a burn down application, whether we're planning no-tiller or more of a reduced tillage system. Do we want to take that glyphosate that we have, that limited resource that you might have, and use it in the burn down? So we're going to go through some different examples of when you might want to use it. Also, what are some potential alternatives? So if we think about using glyphosate, we might decide that, maybe that's the best place to use it is at the beginning of the season and trying to make sure that we start clean with that glyphosate. One thing we know is that many of our burn down applications work better if we have multiple different herbicides in there. And for example, there's been research that's shown the addition of saflufenicil or Sharpen, or you can use a Verdict in corn, can be added to maybe enhance some of our potential cover crops that might be out there, things like cereal rye, annual ryegrass. And the other thing is that saflufenicil out there would be helpful for controlling horseweed or mare's tail. And remember that a lot of those adjuvants that we need to add are going to be important. If we decide to use that glyphosate in that, in our burn down application and know that we're not going to have it, particularly for our post applications, In soybeans, the things we want to consider is, well, we do know that we have some good options for grass control. We have the group 1 herbicides. So things like the clethodims, which are like the Select Max, or Quizalofop like Assure 2. And then we've got some other grass herbicides. Another thing to consider is that if you're planting something like an Enlist E3 soybeans or XtendFlex soybeans, we do have some alternatives to control some of the broadleaves. So some additional products. So, if we're going to use the glyphosate early and don't have it later on to use it later on in the season, make sure you have something that is going to control some of the grasses and broadleaf escapes that you might see. Now with corn, it's a little bit different story. We've got several different options out there that we can use post-emergence that are pretty good on most of the weed species that we're dealing with. Another thing to consider is it's going to be really important to talk about, and we'll talk about them in a few minutes, the pre-residual herbicides with these burn down applications. But if we don't have those residuals herbicides out there and we decide not to have glyphosate for our post application, one of the things that we do run into, particularly for soybeans, is not having a good option for common lamb's quarters control. So that's why it's really going to be important to talk about some of those pre's that we can use with these burn down applications or even after tillage. And we'll talk about those in a few minutes. Another thing to think about is, okay, so if we have limited glyphosate and we decide we don't want to use that glyphosate in that burn down application, what are some of the best opportunities to omit glyphosate from that burn down application? And we're really talking about fields that would be treated the previous fall, also where post-herbicide programs are comprehensive enough to control weed escapes. So again, having those options with some of those new soybean traits like the Enlist E3 or XtendFlex would be helpful. And again, with corn, we've got a lot of alternatives. Now, if we don't use glyphosate in our burn down application, some of the things that we run into is that grasses can be pretty problematic. But we do have some alternative options for annual grass control. So gramoxone, paraquat, a lot of those will provide some burn on some of those annual grasses. And one of the things that we usually run into is some of the issues with things like annual bluegrass early in the season. And no matter what herbicide we use, whether it's glyphosate or some of these alternatives, those applications really need to be on before that annual bluegrass starts to flower. And that's when we usually see some more issues with control. Other things, we do have those group 1 herbicides, again, like clethodim and Quizalofop. The key thing about using those in a burn down is making sure that the temperatures are greater than 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And a lot of times we like to look at those in separate applications because we can see some antagonisms with some of the different mixes. The other thing to consider is we could probably use, if we're in a good burn down application and not focusing on glyphosate to control all the weeds out there, glyphosate at some lower rates can also help with some of the different grass control that would be out there. And again, this would be in a whole program with, tank mixing with things like Sharpen or some of the other pre's that we might have. So when we think about our burn down herbicide programs, a couple things just to make sure you're considering is making sure that we're using about 2 to 3 herbicides that have substantial burn down activity. And that's really not a change from what we've talked about in the past. We also want to make sure that we can use the highest labeled rates of alternative herbicides. In particular, making sure that you're keeping in mind your soil type, the weed sizes, and also the time till planting. So again, for some of our different products, for example, like with 2,4-D ester planting prior to soybeans, we need to make sure that we wait 7 days prior to planting. And there's a few other restrictions there. The other thing to consider is there's a lot of herbicides that we use as pre's that will have some burn down activity. And so for soybeans, things like chloromuron or classic or metribuzin can also give us some burn down activity. So that's pretty helpful. And in corn, atrazine is a good choice. And we've got a full listing of those with some of the activity listed in table 2Q of the weed control guide. So what I thought I would do is quickly go over some of our alternative burn down herbicide programs that really de-emphasize the use of glyphosate. And also to let you know that we will have an article in the MSU News that will really focus on kind of talking about these in a little bit more depth, because I know we're kind of restricted on time today.
Oh, okay.
So one of the things that I would mention is one of the burn down herbicide programs that actually has probably as one of our best non-glyphosate programs is using something like Gramoxone plus 2,4-D plus metribuzin in soybeans. This is going to give us pretty good control of most of our spring weeds, including horseweed, that's going to be less than 6 inches tall. And that's probably where we're going to be at. And the one thing that's nice about this is it does have grass activity. Some of the weaknesses is because it is most of it is contact besides 2,4-D. It's going to be a little bit weaker on perennial weeds than if we had glyphosate. And some other things to consider is with Gramoxone, we do need to have that special training. And there's a link to that in the weed control guide. Some other things we might want to consider is just reducing the rate of glyphosate in some of our mixes. And keeping our broadleaf products like Sharpen and 2,4-D in there. That's going to give us good burn down of things like mare's tail. It's going to help us with some of our cover crop burn down. Where it's going to be a little bit weaker is some of the larger weeds. And then again, because of the lower rate of glyphosate, it may not be as good as what we would typically see. Just remember, we can increase the rate of Sharpen, but there are some restrictions, and those are all listed in the weed guide, and you can see that in the comments section below. Another potential option is something like a Sharpen plus 2,4-D plus metribuzin. It's going to be really good. It's going to give us some residual weed control in there. And just again, remember that we do have some of those restrictions if we're using 2,4-D prior to soybeans. And we can use a pint of 2,4-D ester up to 7 days or more prior to planting soybeans. So remember, we still need that application window. We do have a couple other programs. So just going to put these up here really quick. Things like some of our ALS herbicides like Express or Panaflex, but making sure we have good additional burn down like 2,4-D and again, that metribuzin. With that particular product, one of the weaknesses is going to be grass control. And we talked about how we can use some of our group 1 herbicides like clethodim or Select for grass control. So that might help with some of our burn down applications of cereal rye or annual ryegrass. And then again, just some general mixes that would give us some residual control. Other things to consider with some of our newer soybean traits like the Enlist soybeans or the Extend and Extend Flex soybeans, that does give us the options to using higher 2,4-D rates in the Enlist E3. The big thing is to make sure that you're checking for some of the different tank mixes that you can use. And that's really important to do prior to making those applications. And then with the Extend soybeans, we have those registered dicamba formulations of Extendamax and Ingenia. We also have Tavium, which would include a S-metolachlorosil dual. And remember, with the dicamba in the Extend and Extend Flex soybeans, it will provide us some residual control of mare's tail or horseweed. In corn, really, it's going to be similar types of programs. The big thing is instead of using metribuzin, we would use atrazine. So, really they're set up the same way. And again, we'll cover some of these in the article that Aaron and I will be putting out, hopefully in today's extension news. Verdict is a combination of Sharpen plus Outlook. So that's something we can use some higher rates in corn. So that's going to be helpful for some of our more burn down applications. And again, a lot of these are very similar to what we talked about, but switching out atrazine, putting atrazine in the corn situation versus metribuzin. We also have some ALS inhibitors that give us some good burn down activity, things like basis blend that would give us some good grass control, including that with 2,4-D and atrazine. And then a lot of our premixes that have a group 27, like a Callisto, a dual and an atrazine, those types of premixes all have some good activity. It's important to make sure that you add a crop oil concentrate in there. We can add a little bit more atrazine and actually add some 2,4-D to help with control. Couple other things to consider: cover crops. We do have a cover crops termination guide out there that you can find on the Midwest cover crop site and also the Michigan cover crop site. But without glyphosate, they're going to be a little bit more difficult to control. In corn, we're looking at things that would have clopyralid, so stinger or dicamba, And then in soybeans, looking at some of the extend traits with the use of those registered dicamba formulations. And for cereal ryegrass, we're really looking at combining things like gramoxone and atrazine for corn and gramoxone and metribuzin for soybeans if we don't have glyphosate. Now, the key thing here is to make sure that we control them early, because they're not going to be as good as what a glyphosate is. So, you know, if you're growing cover crops and you're trying to terminate those, if you have some glyphosate, that might be where you really want to focus that particular application. The other thing that's extremely important is making sure that we're using a pre-herbicide that has some residual activity. And that's really what's going to help us in the long run. These soil applied products are going to help us as kind of a foundation program to control some of those hard to control weeds, herbicide resistant weeds. And it also helps us really manage what we're trying to control post-emergence. So it's really important, especially this year, to be putting some of those pre's down. And really those soil applied products can be applied after tillage or in that burn down application. Just to show you a couple quick pictures with and without pre's with horseweed and waterhemp and soybean. So you can see what that pre really does. It does help. And again, that can be whether it's tillage plus following that up with a pre-herbicide or in that burn down application. We've got a lot of different pre's. Just go to the weed guide and we've got tables 1A and 2A gives us that whole listing of those pre's. One of the other things to consider, especially with soybeans, most of our residual herbicides, our pre-herbicides, and some of our burn down herbicides really need to be applied before soybean emergence, or else we can get some pretty severe injuries. So make sure you know what those application timings are. With corn, we have a little bit of flexibility. A lot of our pre's can be applied as an kind of an early post or delayed post. And there is a table 1H in the weed control guide that lists all those different products. So just kind of keep those things in mind, depending on what the weather's like about the time that we're trying to get some of these pre's out. One quick thing I want to mention before I switch it over to Jeff is this year, again, with the low glyphosates or reduced glyphosates availability, one of the questions people have been asking is how low of a glyphosate rate can you use? Remember, we have a lot of very susceptible annual grasses and annual broadleaves. The key thing is that we're not using just glyphosate alone. Glyphosate is going to kind of be an added part of any program. So it's going to be kind of more of a helping partner. So we don't need to be at these super high glyphosate rates that we've kind of switched to over the last 5 years. So there is a new Roundup Power Max, Roundup Power Max 3. And what I really want to focus on here is that it really depends on weed size and the susceptibility of the weeds. And in general, we've kind of moved our Roundup rates up over the last 5 years. And I think this year, when we're limited on supplies and with the increased cost, getting out there earlier and making applications to smaller weeds, making sure that we're using AMS with our glyphosates when we can with some of the different tank mixes. Remember, we can't do that if we're tank mixing with dicamba. But I think really focusing on getting those weeds when they're small, and because we're in those premixes, it's going to be important. And then one other thing just to remind you of, we do have a table in the back of the weed control guide that lists a lot of different glyphosate products. Remember, glyphosates have different salts, they're loaded different ways. And the key thing to look for is what rate it is for that particular glyphosate product. And when we're talking about that 3/4 pound acid equivalent, you can see here, we've got a lot of different application rates. So this kind of just gives you a quick guide for some of the different glyphosate products that are out there. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and skip through this. I don't want to cut too far into in Jeff's spot, but just remember, there's a lot of things to consider for weed control in winter wheat. That'll be coming up pretty quick. We've got the chapter 3 in the weed guide that goes through a lot of these things. So keep that in mind. And one thing I do want to remember or just remind you of is making sure that those temperatures are at least above 50 degrees F or Fahrenheit, or else we can potentially see some injury. And then with that, this is just kind of some of the things that I went over. The weed control guide, we have a new reordering, so you can get those at the bookstore, or you can go to msuweeds.com, and I'll be around for some questions after the presentations. So I'm going to go ahead and switch that over to Jeff, and we'll stop sharing there.
Thanks, Christy. And before we get into the Q&A portion, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. If you want to re-listen to this information this morning, you'll be able to see it on Apple Podcast or Spotify. We'd invite everyone to follow us on Facebook and Twitter at MSUE Field Crops. Or visit our website that's listed below. So with that, again, I'd like to thank everyone, and we're going to go into the Q&A at this point. And I guess I'd like to ask Christy. Christy did an excellent job answering the questions in the chat, but we do have people on the telephone. And I wonder, Christy, if you could go back through and maybe answer those questions quickly, so the folks that are listening on the phone can get the answers.
Sure. One of the questions was, how big a cereal rye will Select or Clethodim take out? And in general, we're looking at smaller cereal rye. And I think with any of our alternatives, we're going to need to be thinking, taking it out probably earlier than what we would want. But we really want to focus on less than 6 inches tall for that application. The other thing to remember is to make sure that the temperature is around 60 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. And part of that question was how long, and I would say probably a day before and a day after, because you want that cereal rye to be actively growing. There's also, again, we have the weed control guide online at msuweeds.com, so you can access it there if you don't have a copy, or you can still purchase one at the MSU bookstore. Another question was, if we're planting soybeans early this year, would you change your recommendations for pre-emergence herbicides or rates? And that's a great question. We're actually starting to do a research project this year that's going to focus on that. One of the things I would say is that with some of our herbicides that tend to potentially cause more injury when it's cold and wet, that can be an issue. So things like flumioxazine or sulfentrazone, some of those products. We'll be looking at some of that the next couple of years at a few different locations. So hopefully we can get you some better recommendations for that early season, those early planted soybeans. The other thing I do want to mention is there was a question about recommendations for weed control and dry beans. In that weed control guide, chapter 5 lists a lot of our recommendations. Also, I know that Scott Bales publishes a dry bean research book, and that chapter is in that book. So if you happen to get that from the Dry Bean Commission, that information is in there also.
Peter had a question about how big of cereal rye will Select or Clethodim take out? I think.
Yeah, Paul, that was the first question I answered.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm trying to multitask, and I don't do that very well. Ask my wife.
Yeah, and we've tried some later applications, and in general, it's definitely not like a glyphosate. So when we've went up to 12 inches tall, it just kind of sits there, and so the earlier the better.
Anyone else have any other questions? I have one, Christy. A lot of folks are going after some of those early applications of these, some of these winter annuals, primarily chickweed. How actively growing does that weed have to be? How early is too early, especially in some of the alfalfas and some of those types of no-till situations? Does that weed have to, is there a temperature, how many days at 60 degrees or?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Paul. I think one of the things is every weed has kind of its different, kind of low growing point or max or minimum temperature that they'll grow at. So each weed's going to be a little bit different. And it also is going to depend on what herbicide you're using. So something like metribuzin has some soil applied activity. So that probably would help. It probably wouldn't have to be as more actively growing as what something that would be more contact and just going or being absorbed into the plant. So because we have some soil activity with something like metribuzin, it can be taken up, probably by the roots once it starts growing too. So a lot of that's really going to just be dependent on the herbicide that you're using as well as the weed.
Okay, thank you, Christy.
Christy, I have a question for you too. I know most farmers do not cut rates on herbicides, but I heard of one farmer that did it. Well, maybe more than one. And what do you think of cutting rates on herbicides? And how does that affect the effectiveness of those herbicides?
Yeah, so in general, we do not want to cut rates. But as I mentioned before, with, kind of because we're with our limited glyphosate, some people might be thinking that we're cutting rates. But if you actually look at where we were about 5 years ago, when glyphosate was cheap, we really started using a lot more, right? So it's making sure that you match what the susceptibility is of that weed to that glyphosate rate. And if you actually look at the glyphosate rate table on a label, and again, we're not using glyphosate in those situations to control all the weeds that are out there. We're using them to maybe pick up grass control, which is generally very susceptible. So with the other herbicides, like I said, we need to be using our full rates to make sure we get the best control where we're at.
I think I'll thank everyone again for joining us this morning on the fifth year again, kicking it off. And we invite everyone to join us each week as our topics change and the weather changes, and we need to stay on top of our game this year. So with that, have a good day, have a good week, and we'll see you next Thursday.